So there's sort of two parts to this talk, and one is would be a fair amount of overlap with what other speakers have, so I'll try to get through that quickly and get to the second half, which is involving some very preliminary data we had, which involved balance and control of orientation during a Gait-like test, which might be more interesting to a lot of people here than just standing still. So you saw that picture already in my lab, and so subjects can stand there sometimes freestanding like this, and the surface can rotate and the visual surround can rotate. Other times we want to simplify the biomechanics of the system, so we have a backboard assembly that can freely rotate around ankle joint angles, but you then restrict the body mechanics to be that of a inverted single link inverted pendulum. And doesn't bother people to a large extent, and you get very similar data to what you get in the freestanding conditions if you just consider freestanding center of mass motion. So the model you've also already seen that Herman talked about, including, and we add the visual loop now, so the vision just comes in as a separate feedback loop, graviception, vestibular proprioception, this torque feedback loop that Herman mentioned briefly, and that has the dynamics of, it's really not equivalent to the other sensory systems. It's by our sort of inclusion of that in the model, what it accounts for is very low frequency and slow corrections in balance, such that if you're standing on the surface tilts, you tend to orient to the surface, and if the surface remained tilting, you would remain oriented, except that you have this torque feedback, which senses you're exerting a lot of torque, and it's a positive feedback loop, it slowly brings you back into an upright orientation. So that's functionally, that feedback loop is different from vision, graviception, and proprioception. So I've called this thing the independent channel model, and it's independent in the sense that vision, vestibular, and proprioception aren't necessarily sensing the same information. So vision senses your body sway relative to the visual world, which might be moving. Proprioception senses your body sway relative to the surface tilt. Surface might not be level. Graviception senses body sway in space, the spatial orientation sensors. So it might seem strange that you would then perform sensory integration by some weighted summation, because that's like adding oranges and apples and bananas together, and you normally shouldn't do that. But I think the brain says, just give me all the fruit, and I'll figure out sort of what to do with it the best I can. So that was the model, and that you also have seen this before. So that's an example data, eyes closed, surface tilting. You body sway, increase the amplitude, you get this saturation effect, which if you interpret results based on that model, it comes out to be sensory reweighting is the explanation for that. And in addition to giving a surface stimulus, which you get this family of transfer function curves with the lower gain for the larger stimulus amplitudes, gain of 1 is being perfectly aligned with the tilting surface. And so if you were a mannequin and your feet were glued to the surface and the surface tilted, you would have a gain of 1 and a phase of 0 across all frequencies. For visual stimulus, you get a similar pattern of results. Pattern meaning the gain is a little lower at low frequencies, maximal gain in mid frequencies, which are like 0.1 to 1 hertz, and then a declining gain at higher frequencies. Visual, that pattern of gain is similar. The gain decrease with increasing stimulus amplitude is similar. Phase curves are sort of similar, have a phase lead at low frequencies, and then an increasing phase lag at higher frequencies, which is mainly accounted for by time delays in the system. And this just shows predicted, frequency response function curves that you would get from this model, and you can see just the general shape of those curves is consistent with the experimental data, and you can do a curve fit of the parameters of the differential equation represented by that block diagram, and estimate all those parameters, including the sensory weights, and as Herman showed you already and this is an eyes closed condition, surface tilting at this very low stimulus amplitude, which you can't even perceptually detect you're being stimulated. You're using about 70% proprioception and 30% vestibular. At high stimulus amplitude, it's reversed, about 30% proprioception and 70% vestibular. And so now we've got a simple model that can predict quite a bit, and you would want to then test it a little bit. And so one simple test would be to simplify the system in a different way, and this would be to take some subjects with bilaterally absent vestibular function and then have them close their eyes, and then repeat these kind of experiments of what would you predict you should get for sensory weights in this condition. No vestibular system, no visual system, just proprioception. So would you be able to reweight with changing stimulus amplitude? No, I wouldn't think so. Probably the answer. But I would say you should get a proprioceptive weight of 1. You're entirely reliant on proprioception, and you can't do anything. So when the amplitude gets bigger, all you have is proprioception to rely on. And so that's the result that you get for vestibular loss subjects. And this is what it looks like in the time domain. So at the very lowest stimulus amplitude, normal subjects in vestibular loss look about the same, but as you double the stimulus amplitude, you get about double this way. Double the stimulus amplitude again, you get double, and you get double this way again. Double, and you get nothing because they've fallen over. They can just barely be able to hold on and to sway this much. And that's only a stimulus that has peak-to-peak amplitude of 4 degrees. So you're fairly disabled in specialized conditions if you start missing sensory systems. So another test of this model was to do something a little bit more complicated. So you have 2 inputs, vision and surface tilt proprioception, and and the model is essentially linear. And with a linear model, you would expect superposition to hold. We gave 2 mathematically uncorrelated pseudorandom stimuli together simultaneously and separately. And we varied their amplitudes of those so we gave it, say, visual stimulus separately, varying the amplitude, surface tilt stimulus separately, varying the amplitude, and then all combinations in between. And you can analyze that data in a similar way. And it turns out, these are mathematically uncorrelated stimuli, so you should be able to separate the effects of responses due to one and the other. And you can separately, and the model does a pretty good, provides a pretty good explanation for the data, and pretty good means that if you only include data up to about 1 hertz or so, it's very good. But there are limitations. But this is just the pretty good result, which is if you take the visual, keep the surface tilt stimulus at 1 degree, vary the visual tilt, and you can then estimate the proprioceptive weight, visual weight, and vestibular is 1 minus the sum of those 2. And so even though the surface tilt stimulus remains the same, as you increase the visual stimulus amplitude, the blue is you start to rely more and more on perception, even though that's, say, inaccurate because it's constantly moving. So the visual weight down weights, perception up weights, and vestibular up weights do compensate. And if I just collapse that data into that narrower set of bar graphs, and then we can add in all the other conditions that we tested. And so here, that's a 2 degree, 4 degree, and 8 degree surface tilt amplitudes, and within each column, you're increasing the visual weights. And so you can then visualize the whole pattern of weight changes that people are compensating for this complex stimulus condition. And at the extreme, when the surface is at peak to peak 8 degrees and vision is 8 degrees, then you're relying about 75% or so on vestibular system for balance control. So the pretty good versus very good model. So the independent channel, as I said, was good up to about 1 hertz, but data above that, you just can't make it work as well. And so we considered various other modifications of the model in order to see if we could explain everything. And so we considered things like adding stretch reflex, adding more complex muscle tendon mechanics, adding activation, muscle activation dynamics, and neither of those really helped us to explain the data. But what did help some was to consider that the time delays in the different feedbacks could be potentially different, and just to match up with what Tim Kiemel talked about. So what we estimated was a 243 millisecond time constant for vision, perception 104 milliseconds, vestibular was 90 milliseconds. This torque feedback pathway, 500, so really long, something very sluggish. Corrections for sort of mean orientation position. And then the other thing was to abandon completely the simple weighting concept and essentially saying that the position and velocity information carried in different sensory channels might independently be weighted, essentially, and that those, so there's not a single weighting factor, but and that's true also for all of the other sensory feedback channels. And that was really the big effect that could allow us to explain all the data. And then the problem is when you start adding parameters, you can start fitting things better, but you'd want to know whether you're overdoing it. So we used like the Akiki information criteria and Bayesian information criteria to try to judge whether we were overdoing it, and this model didn't overdo it. And this is the gain curves that that model was fitting, that alternative model as a function of all these combinations. So now the second part, and this is very preliminary, but so when you're standing on this tilting surface, I mean, there is, the tendency to orient to it. And you could imagine that if something similar happens, during walking, then you've added an extra complication. If you walk on a tilted surface and you orient to that tilted surface, then you become asymmetrical. So if you lift up the foot that's on the side that you're tilted towards, I mean, gravity has a bigger effect than when you lift up the foot on the other side. And so what mechanisms might be coming into play to both maintain that orientation, or even the first question is, do you really orient like you do in quiet standing during a gait-like task? So we, just to fit on our platform, essentially we used a stepping in place task rather than actual walking task. So you're standing there on the platform the subject is facing laterally, so when the platform tilts, that's a medial lateral perturbation to balance. And we measure center of pressure, estimate center of mass, motion, position of the right and left feet, and then the contact times with the stance times and swing times for so-called swing times for the stepping. And here shows some experimental results. So different amplitudes of surface perturbations. The gray line is the center of mass position, so you're just oscillating back and forth as you're stepping in place. And the red line is just a low-pass filter to visualize sort of the mean orientation of the subject during the stepping in place task. And you can see, that scales somewhat with amplitude and has some correlation with the stimulus shape, and you can calculate a frequency response function from this data, and that's shown just for one subject here in comparison to frequency response functions for medial lateral sway from averaged across a group of, I think, 8 subjects there. And so you see similarity. So below the stepping frequency of 0.8 hertz here, the shape of the frequency response functions is very similar in stance and during the stepping in place task. So the gain is highest at mid frequencies, drops off at low frequencies, phase lead at low frequency, increasing phase lag with increasing frequency. And so there is, to some approximation, these effects of orientation control during stepping in place are similar to what they are during quiet stance. And so if that's true, then you have the problem that I mentioned. You're tending to be oriented in one direction while you're stepping, and so you have this asymmetric action of gravity. And Art Quo, 1999, talked about these set of mechanisms for controlling your medial lateral stability. So you can have the ability to exert ankle torque in the stance foot, this reaction wheel thing, and then also something related to just upper body torsal motion to create a reaction torque. Varying the step width, which seems to be the main focus for controlling medial lateral sway, and then also torsional spring deal. And then more recently, Christophe Malfroy, sorry, Christophe, you'll have to correct everybody. Christophe Malfroy, I think, in his thesis work had another scheme for medial lateral stance control, which he referred to as this phase modulation. And so that notion is that if you find yourself moving, say, too far to the right when you're on your right foot, then you can just stay on that foot just a little longer to allow the torque due to gravity to correct for just a little bit longer to start to bring you back into a desired trajectory. And we analyzed our stepping data, and we couldn't find evidence for the step width modulation for controlling balance. We did find evidence for some mechanism somewhat similar to Christophe's phase modulation. And so, and it's quantified here, so if we calculate the stance time asymmetry measure as the difference between stance time for the right foot versus left on adjacent steps divided by the mean value, and then plot that stance time asymmetry in blue here as a function of the stimulus waveform, and you can see the modulation is matched up reasonably well. So when the surface is tilted, subjects tend to be tilted, say pluses to the right. They tend to increase the stance time on the right leg, and when it's tilted to the left, they increase stance time on the left leg. And you can do a correlation, surface tilt position versus that asymmetry measure, and it's a fairly good linear correlation. And the slope of that, I would argue, is some type of gain control sensitivity. And so the steeper the slope, the more you're applying this step time asymmetry effect to maintain balance. And then the final thing is we did a few manipulations of things. So this condition C1 is just stepping in place. These are all eyes closed data, by the way. So that's just eyes closed stepping in place. And then condition C2, we made a little guide between the feet, and we said you have to, when you step down, you have to be against the guide. So that took away the ability to modulate your step width. And there was little change, only slight change in the stance time asymmetry measures. And then the C3 condition was to also step against this guide, but onto a narrow rail, which was about 2 centimeters wide. So that would largely take away the ability to make ankle joint corrections. And then you get like almost a doubling of this asymmetry slope. So suggesting that control factor was, well, first of all, suggesting that you are using ankle torque to control your balance during this test. And then when you take that away, you compensate for that by adjusting this step time asymmetry. And finally, the C4 condition was to have a backboard type thing, which would prevent upper body motion relative to the lower body to prevent this reactive correction, and that really didn't do anything. So I think just in these conditions, which are relatively small perturbations, that this stance time asymmetry or phase modulation scheme is something that humans really do use. So I think that is last slide. So thank you.
Takes some time for questions. Andy,
I would like it if, in the course of the questions, all of the speakers in this session could draw a Venn diagram of your results and opinions. What parts overlap and which parts are distinct. Just without following every word, I'm having trouble seeing what was the same and what was different between them, or especially across the class.
Yeah, these things are complicated enough. I mean, like, for example, when I saw Tim's presentation, I'm really concentrating hard. And for me, I need more than the presentation. I need his paper, and I need to study it. So I don't have a media thing. So the one thing that was similar was that time delay, because in previous models, that has been tending to be lumped together as like one universal time delay for stance control. And Tim was saying 250 milliseconds, and our results when we did this more complex model was 240 milliseconds. So that was sort of nice to see that. So that's at least one overlapping thing. One non-overlapping thing with Tim that I'm not sure, but it might be non-overlapping, is what he was describing as no change in the controller. And I'm wondering, with our more complex model, where I ended up breaking down the feedback into separate position and velocity related contributions of each different sensory system, that seems to me that would be a change in controller, which maybe is different than what he is saying he saw in the way he analyzes data. So at least those are two things.
Maybe you missed it, but most of your system identification uses essentially noise as these tools.
Yeah.
And presumably you did that so that subjects are not trying to detect patterns in the excitation.
Well, that's part of the reason, but it was actually, another reason is just efficiency efficiency in doing these kind of experiments, because if you did things, one frequency at a time, and all these different amplitudes, and then surface tilt and visual tilt, and even more conditions, I mean, you would never get done. And so you would never have any data to analyze. So that's part of it. But I think, the issue of, is there predictability, or do we take away the ability of people to predict because we happen to give this kind of stimulus, and therefore, I mean, our results maybe are valid, but maybe only, for that stimulus condition. So those are open questions.
So have you tested your modeling against simpler stimulation, say sinusoids or perturbations and so on?
What was the second perturbation? Just like transient or something like that? Yeah, they're not totally, I mean, not systematically, but they're not totally the same, because the system overall is nonlinear, and the fact that you are presumably adjusting these weights, so that takes a certain amount of time. So if you give a transient stimulus, I mean, then you're going to have an overlap or an interference, I don't know what you call it, overlap or interference of weights changing, during the perturbation. I think Sue Park did some experiments, and with Art, I think when they did transient perturbations, and when they modeled essentially the control gain as a function of time, I mean, that changed over time. So that's not something that would be captured in these kind of steady state models. So in general, you give a different perturbation, you're going to get something different, as opposed to like a linear system.
Oh, sorry, can I discriminate against you, Chris?
I thought that the sense line symmetry was very interesting. If there's a coupling between the sideways motion towards the forward motion, so by increasing the sense line, you're also going to need to take a longer step. Is that did you observe that?
Yeah, so we were just stepping in place, so we weren't moving forward in this experiment, but we actually wanted to do something a little bit closer to walking, and so we had people walking, but to give them a perturbation, we used this galvanic vestibular stimulus. So Herman showed the video of that. So if you're facing forward, you give that galvanic stimulus, you tend to, lean, depending on the clarity, to one side or another. So that's sort of similar in the sense that you're trying to walk forward with your center of mass twisted over, and then we did see something similar, but we didn't have it instrumented to look at the step width on that either. And then the other thing just to mention, so stance time asymmetry, the other term I like for this would be limp control system. So limping, because that's what you end up doing, I mean, when you do that. So I try to, if I happen to want to keep myself positioned here, not because my left foot is injured, but because my sensor integration is telling me to be over here, then, and I want to walk forward, I limp. So that's the mechanism, essentially.
Is this system three-dimensional, or is it three decoupled systems? That has implications for whether you have to do Kalman filters, in other words, time domain processing, equicombinatorial centrifugal forces, or whether the frequency domain approach is going to handle general behavior.
I'm not quite sure how to answer that, except there's nothing general about this. I mean, it gets back to also, it's stimulus dependent and time dependent changes. That's probably not what you're asking.
Do you think you can?
So which part is decoupled? You're mentioning decoupling.
So you say I have a sagittal plane, I have a
Oh.
coronal plane,
Yeah.
and those two things basically don't interact.
That would be, if I was postulating about things, that's what I would start out with, that hypothesis. But then I don't know for sure.
Okay, I have exciting news. Coffee, 10 minutes. Let's thank Bob again.